2 weeks after the budget was announced, the public still appears to not be on board with several of its key measures. So how is the government going to get its $37 billion in funding cuts through the Senate? Well, I'm joined now by Steve Ciobo, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Treasurer, and Greens Senator Scott Ludlam is also with us in our Canberra studio. Gentlemen, welcome to you.
Thanks, Helen.
Good evening.
Steve Ciobo, did you get negative feedback about the budget from your constituents when you were on your break?
Oh, look, I had some positive feedback, I had some negative feedback. Ultimately, though, Helen, what people said to me was that they understood that when the government's faced with a situation where we're borrowing $1 billion every month just to pay the interest on the debt that Labor left behind, tough decisions have to be made. So I do think ultimately that message got through. Did
the negative feedback outweigh the positive?
No, not for a second do I think the negative feedback outweighed the positive. In my city,
the opinion
on the
polls
Gold
aren't
Coast,
reflected in your seat?
Well, look, of course, seats vary. We're not one homogenous group all across the country, Helen. I mean, obviously, there's different points of view in different parts of the world. In my city, a tourism town, a small business capital of Australia, the clear message was that people understood that tough decisions had to be made, and they recognised that we have a mountain of debt and deficit that needs to be repaid, and simply carrying on, pretending that the music hasn't stopped and that we can just keep doing what we've been doing for the past 6 years, I should say that Labor's been doing for the past 6 years, is not a viable, sustainable, long-term solution.
Steve Ciobo, passage of these measures through the Senate is going to be tricky. Is the government on the back foot now? Will you have to compromise on some measures?
Well, look, I think it's too early to say. Ultimately, the simple choice that falls in front of all senators is this. Do they recognise that we cannot continue to run multi-year, multi-billion-dollar deficits? If they recognise that the fiscal pathway, the growth in spending trajectory that Labor left behind is unsustainable, then what's the alternative? Now, we've put forward our clear plan. We've put forward a plan that's consistent with our commitments, that's consistent with our attempt to get Australia back on track. Now, it's well and good for minor parties and for the Labor Party and for others to want to throw rocks at it and say, well, you shouldn't do this and you shouldn't do that, and that's fine, Helen. But ultimately, what are the alternatives? Because in the absence of actual sustainable alternatives, all there really is a recipe for the continuation of the same reckless spending that got Australia on a pathway to $667 billion worth of debt.
Senator Scott Ludlam, will the Greens just say no to pretty much everything, as Treasurer Joe Hockey is warning won't be tolerated, he says, by the Australian people?
Won't be tolerated is a really curious way of putting it. I think you mentioned in your intro, you were wondering out loud how the government would deal with a hostile Senate. I don't think the Senate is hostile. I think this is the most hostile budget that any of us have ever seen. Steve asked before quite reasonably, what are the alternatives? And I think the first thing to say is, well, why don't we have a properly constituted mining tax? Why don't we keep the carbon price in place? That's raising revenue that goes into general revenue and is helping drive the transition. Why don't we look at some of the extraordinary super concessions that are in place, or some of the other really perverse incentives in our tax system? The fact is the government has gone into this issue of this so-called imaginary budget emergency with a blindfold on. They haven't wanted to hit up the big end of town. Everybody else is being told they have to pay. And I can tell you what, the feedback that we got over the break since Budget Week was not 50-50 in favour and 50-50 opposed. I have been overwhelmed by the degree to which people have decided to step up and fight the passage of this budget.
Scott Ludlam, you mentioned the mining tax and the carbon price. I mean, they were issues that the government campaigned very strongly against and told the Australian people that they wanted to get rid of them. They were voted in with a big majority. So, in a sense, are you just banging your head against a brick wall about that?
Feels like it some days, but no, I mean, you're quite right.
Why are you continuing on with it when the electorate said, yes, we approve of the government, and that was part of their platform?
Well, two things. The government was elected with quite a large majority into the House of Reps last September, but as is so often the case, the Australian people took out some insurance and made sure that the numbers in the Senate were not such that the government could just ram through its agenda without review or consideration. So that's the first thing. You need to be able to pass your measures through both houses of Parliament, and I think that insurance, that's effectively why the Senate's there. The second thing, though, is that the government tested that proposition again in Western Australia in the by-election just this last April, and their vote collapsed. Their vote fell by another 5%. So I feel as though I'm representing a very strong constituency in saying you keep those measures intact, your hallucination of a budget emergency basically disappears, and we don't then need to just blindly pass this extraordinary assault on students, on pensioners, on homeless people, on Aboriginal people and on ordinary families and everyone else around the country who is dismayed by the budget. All
right, when you say blindly pass it, I go back to my original question. Will you say no to pretty much everything?
No, I don't know that we necessarily will. I think, as Christine said earlier in the day, there'll be negotiations that'll be undertaken on the floor of Parliament.
So you will agree to the hike in the fuel excise?
No, we haven't seen yet how the government proposes to hypothecate that. So even again, there's a measure that I think a lot of economists believe is entirely sensible, and it was a mistake for Mr Howard to freeze the excise back in 2001 or whenever it was. And yet the government, the Prime Minister is saying every cent of it is going to be going across into these obscene urban freeways, and they've completely crashed Commonwealth funding for public transport. So it's all very well if we want people to get out of their cars, but we have to provide alternatives for that. So I guess what I will say is that we've got 2 weeks. It started today. The Senate's not sitting at the moment. We've got 2 weeks of budget estimates to go through the budget line by line. While they're shouting about it in the House of Reps, that's what we'll be doing, is going through the budget very carefully.
All right. At this stage, though, Scott Ludlam, have the Greens, your leadership or yourself, but Christine Milne in particular, had any contact from Tony Abbott or Joe Hockey or any senior member of the government to start talking or negotiating?
No. As of about 8 o'clock this morning, which was the last time that our party room met, or 9 o'clock this morning, no contact from the government at all. And keeping in mind the Prime Minister's a bit of a crash through a crash sort of a character. His statements thus far have been a bit mixed. On the one hand, he said he wants to smash the budget through. On the other hand, and take us to a double dissolution if necessary. And on the other hand, he said there's some room for negotiation at the margins. The feedback that we're getting from people right across the spectrum is that this is not a marginal issue. It's the most hostile budget people have ever seen. Steve
Chabot, do you think that's a good way to handle this passage through the Senate? I mean, Independent Senator Nick Xenophon is also asking if silence is a new negotiating tactic of the coalition. He hasn't heard from the government either.
Well, Alan, bear in mind that the appropriations bill and the temporary budget deficit levy are the only bills that have been introduced. Bear in mind, it was only last week that the government brought down the budget, well, I should say last sitting week, and so now the actual measures start to come into the House of Representatives, and then of course in due course they go up to the Senate. So I think everyone should just take a glass of water, frankly, and calm down. The bills will go into the House of Representatives, and then of course they'll make their way to the Senate. Now over this period, of course, discussions will be had, people will talk about it, but let's be clear about this, Helen. We've got a mandate from the Australian people. We were given a very strong mandate. And when I hear Scott, and I've heard other parties as well, make the claims that, well, they should reintroduce a properly constituted mining tax and they should keep the carbon tax in place and they should make changes around superannuation to tax people who are providing for their own retirement more. You know what I hear, Helen? I hear things that run 180 degrees contrary to the clear commitment that we took to the last election and that the Australian people gave us a mandate for. So I'm sorry if the Greens need to step up to the plate and if the other political parties like the Labor Party need to understand a message that could not have been more crystal clear from the Australian people. They don't want the world's biggest carbon tax, they don't want the mining tax, and they don't want us to fiddle with superannuation when they're providing for their own retirement. And that message could not have been any more
promises that you did take to the election that many would argue you have broken. You said there'd be no cuts or changes to education, to health, and some of those things are going to be changed if this budget gets
Helen,
through.
Tell me, for example, where we're changing education funding that's inconsistent with what we said before the election.
Did you say that you would cut funding on courses at in higher education institutions?
But Helen, we're not doing that. And this is the key point. We're not doing that. If you look at education funding, we're providing an additional $1.2 billion of funding for education over the next 4 years. Now, Labor's out there claiming that there's an education cut because...
you are cutting the course funding for various courses to universities. Is that not correct?
No, Labor hacked billions of dollars out of the tertiary education sector, and when it comes to school funding, we're providing $1.2 billion of additional funding. Now, what we have, well, as I said, Labor cut billions out of higher education.
Well, what we are
doing on higher education, Helen, is we are deregulating the sector so that Australian universities aren't trapped in a mid-pack attitude, but actually have the opportunity, in the same way that the secondary and primary school sectors are deregulated, incidentally, in exactly the same way that the primary and secondary school sectors are deregulated. We're now looking at doing that for tertiary. So I think that it's important that we don't just run with the pack in terms of banding about the kinds of lines that Labor wants to be out there, but actually stick to the facts. And when it comes to the facts, we're providing more funding for health. When it comes to health, for education, when it comes to health, we're providing more funding for health each year over the next 4 years. And this notion that there are cuts in these sectors are simply untrue because they're based on Labor's estimates of spending in years 6 to year 10. And guess what, Helen? There was no money for it, no money whatsoever. All there was a big IOU from Bill Shorten, and frankly, that would never have been realised.
All right, well, on the health funding, we've had the AMA, one of the senior doctors there, come out, and he is talking about a $5 cut to the Medicare rebate.
Well, I mean, in relation to what? On which item? What are you referring to?
The Medicare rebate will be cut by $5.
Are you talking about in terms of an actual, for a general consultation, do you mean?
That's right.
Yeah, well, that's in relation to the $7 co-payment. So $5 goes to the fund, $2 goes to the doctors, and when it comes to those doctors that choose to bulk bill...
you're raising that now from the patient, and they get $5 less back from Medicare as their rebate. So that is a cut in health.
If there's not a co-payment. But if you look at the actual payments that's being made, Helen, in terms of the Medicare benefits scheme, the growth in Medicare benefits scheme continues. And the problem, Helen, is that we recognise that Labor left a ticking time bomb in a whole raft of areas in relation to increased government expenditure. But this is the very issue, Helen. We need to find savings. We need to achieve savings. And I think it's important to recognise that
status quo will not continue. But you've just said you're not cutting health and education.
That's correct.
And now you're saying that you need to find savings.
Because what we're changing, Helen, is the rate of indexation and the growth. I think let's be clear about this. A slowdown in the growth of
hang on, I just want to clarify this. That you haven't been able to be clear enough, that you haven't convinced the public.
If you don't interrupt me, Helen, I'll be very clear about it, and I'll explain it right now.
Go ahead now.
All right, well, let me explain very clearly what we're doing. The rate of growth in health and education is being changed. So health and education is still increasing, but it just won't be increasing as fast as it would have been if Labor had stayed in power. And the reason that's necessary is because Labor's projected rate of growth was completely unsustainable, and that would have meant a much bigger car crash, frankly, in another 4 or 5 years' time than the small changes we're making now.
Well, you have had to withstand 2 weeks of protests and criticism from a variety of sources. The big problems for the government seem to be the issue of broken promises broadly, and that it's perceived to be not fairly shared across all groups. Did that surprise you and Joe Hockey that the electorate so far hasn't bought your arguments for tough cuts?
Well, I would just exercise a degree of caution about sort of these broad-ranging assertions you're making. I mean, I don't believe it's the case that the electorate doesn't support this budget. Certainly there are elements within the community that don't. I accept that. But does it surprise us? No, it doesn't surprise us. We never went into this budget expecting to sort of get a 10-point bounce in the polls off the back of it, Helen. We know that tough budgets, tough measures are always, of course, going to cause angst in the community. But the key point is this: these decisions are a necessary necessary consequence from a fiscal situation that's been left behind by a Labor government that was borrowing $1 billion a month just to pay the interest on the debt that was left behind. Status quo is not an option. There must be changes. We're trying to do it in a tough but fair way.
On the unfairness front, the community perhaps sees that, for instance, business received a tax cut, a small one, but they received a tax cut. So in a sense, where's the heavy lifting for business? Yet low-income families and young people and eventually pensioners will bear the brunt of some of these spending cuts that you are trying to make.
Well, Helen, Australia's business community is already relatively highly taxed in relation to the rest of the developed world. So if somebody's seriously suggesting that we should increase the company tax rate, let me tell them very clearly what the consequence of that will be. Increases in company taxes will make businesses less profitable, will put increased pressure on the business community, and will mean fewer jobs. Full stop. So for whoever's out there arguing that what we should be doing is increasing company tax, I think that they need to go and enrol.
I didn't argue that. I'm wondering why there was a cut to the business rate of tax.
Because we're trying to create better business conditions, Helen. We had great success when we were last in power to bring unemployment down to a record 33-year low. We did that by making business conditions conducive for, one, businesses being profitable, and two, for people to be employed. If we want to tackle unemployment, we've got to create good conditions for the business community and a stronger economy. And that's the reason why we did what we did. But bear in mind, Helen, of course, that increased profitability for companies flows back as dividends, which are taxed anyway as personal income. So, I think that people shouldn't get too excited about what's happening with the company tax rate.
Scott Ludlam, are you going to support things like changes for apprentices, the trade support loans of up to $20,000 over 4-year apprenticeship? Do you think these are a good idea to replace the tools allowance that apprentices got?
That's the sort of stuff that we're going through in budget estimates. That's not an area of the budget that I've actually been focusing on. So the whole Greens team is going through the budget line by line over this fortnight. And that's the sort of thing, if there's areas of the budget like that that have merit, that's why I was a bit hesitant before when you said you're just going to say no to everything. If there's areas that have merit, we'll put our heads together during this estimates fortnight and work out where those are.
Steve Chobo, do you think it's a good idea that apprentices who did get a tools allowance, now, as I understand it, that's going and it's going to be replaced, they can take out a loan, like a HEX loan, a lower interest loan, but these are some of the lowliest paid in the community. Do you think it's fair they should take out loans instead of getting the allowance?
I think it is absolutely great news that the benefits that have flowed to the tertiary education sector and students that are enrolled at university now will be offered for trades training. I think that's fantastic. I mean, if you're wanting to be an apprentice, you'll be able to borrow up to $20,000 on a concessional loan basis, the same to invest in human capital, to invest in your knowledge, because that is a great outcome, and that's what university students have been doing for decades, and frankly, I think it's a wonderful outcome and better than the existing, or I should say the pre-existing, incentives that were in place. Absolutely.
All right, so you think that apprentices will take out up to $20,000 in loans when some of them earn a couple of $100s a week?
Well, importantly, Helen, it doesn't matter how much you earn until you break $50,000. So even if they earn a couple $100 a week, they don't need to worry because they don't have to pay that money back. Not until they earn more than $50,000 a year. And in the same way that university students will earn $1 million more over their lifetime than someone without a tertiary degree, someone with a good trade behind them, someone who is actually qualified in a trade, is going to have a much higher earning potential than someone who has no skills and is unqualified. So frankly, I do think that it's a good outcome, and I do think that they'll see the common sense of investing in themselves, investing in that education, knowing that they don't have to pay a dollar back until their income exceeds $50,000.
On higher education, Christopher Pyne seems to be signalling, Steve Chobo, that the interest rate for HEX loans might be reconsidered and also perhaps change the income threshold for graduates when that loan has to be repaid.
Well, I mean, he's not made any announcement along those lines, Helen, so
do you think there will
we've got
be
a
some
policy
room
package
to move on that score?
Well, look, this applies to all aspects of the budget, your question. And ultimately, our point is this. We've taken now to the Australian people and to the Parliament what we consider to be a clear pathway forward, a sustainable pathway, a pathway that arrests the massive growth in expenditure that was clearly unsustainable, and more importantly, a pathway that goes about doing a couple of things. Getting business conditions right to make sure that the community is wealthier and employs more people. And secondly, we start to address the yawning gap in terms of debt and deficit so that over time we can start to pay down the debt, because if we don't pay down the debt, Helen, it's our kids that will have to do it, and that's intergenerational theft.
All right, I do want to change the subject and talk a little about the report on the Manus Island riot and the death of the detainee Reza Barati. He was murdered and he wasn't involved in any of the previous disturbance. Steve Chobo, are you horrified that in your name that security and other officials at the Australian Outsourced Detention Centre kick a man when he's down and then drop a huge rock on him and kill him?
Look, of course, the circumstances are tragic. Absolutely. There's no other way to describe it than tragic. I think that it's appropriate that there was a thorough investigation into this. I think it's very important that we undertake this activity. I'm also equally concerned and consider it to be an equal tragedy, the fact that over 1,000 people died at sea trying to make the journey to Australia, Helen. So in that respect, from my perspective, I think the best thing that we can hope for going forward is that we have a situation where we no longer have boats attempting to make the perilous journey from other countries to Australia, because that ultimately is going to save lives.
Scott Ludlam, do you accept that rationale?
No, I don't accept the rationale at all. Somebody was murdered. We had a duty of care as the Australian government putting this policy in. The minister was warned for months in advance that that basically things were getting more and more chaotic inside the centre, and one of the key reasons why things went so tragically wrong on Manus Island is that the government has not been providing people, traumatised people fleeing war and genocide in our region, not telling them a thing about whether they will ever be released, why they've been interned, whether there's any future for them at all. And it's just appalling to see the Minister at his press conference earlier today effectively shifting blame back to refugees for the fact that they were attacked and one of them was murdered. Looking through some of the details of the brutality of the attack in that prison camp, I think we're actually very fortunate that more people weren't killed, and what we can see is that nothing has been learned. Nothing's been learned by this government. Under any previous government, under any kind of form of ministerial accountability, Mr Morrison would have resigned, not today, but in February when this disaster occurred. Steve
Chobo, the Minister has in fact accepted the 13 recommendations of the report, but can you and the government say, can you guarantee that detention centre is now safe?
Well, what we know, Helen, I will answer your question. I just want to pick up on one thing that Scott said. Scott spoke about putting the blame on refugees. Completely false. For starters, there are no refugees in detention camps. So, frankly, I think the Greens need to clean up their language a bit, because they like to run the line that every single asylum seeker is a refugee. But
all right, just to my question,
not everyone is.
If you could answer my question, thank you.
Yeah, sure. The most fundamental way that we can provide safety and security is by making sure that we no longer have arrivals. In the final year of the Howard government, Helen, there were 3 people in mandatory detention. Problems that occurred at Manus Island didn't occur when there are 3 people in mandatory detention. What we are desperately keen to do is not only look after the safety and welfare of those people in processing centres, but more importantly, make sure that we don't lose another 1,000 lives by people coming on boats, paying people smugglers,
all right. My
overcrowding ships to get here.
Can you guarantee that detention centre is safe?
Well, Helen, with the greatest of respect, I think that's a silly question. I mean, I can't guarantee what every single person's going to do. I can't guarantee if every asylum seeker in that camp is going to behave appropriately towards each other and so on and so forth. I mean, obviously, no one can do that. But what I can say is this. We've done a comprehensive review of what took place. There are procedures in place to try to minimise any sorts of breakouts or minimise the disruptions that took place. Fundamentally, though, The best thing to guarantee it doesn't happen is to make sure that people aren't in those camps to begin with.
All right, I want to ask one final question, Steve Ciobo. Will you get the role of Assistant Treasurer?
Look, I'm sure when Arthur Sinodinos comes back, he will make an outstanding contribution exactly the same way that he has in the past, Helen, and I look forward to him joining the team again.
So is he going to come back as Assistant Treasurer?
Well, I mean, I expect so. He's just stood aside while this process is taking place, and of course he's been
While the corruption inquiry was looking into his role?
Well, no, he's a witness to the inquiry, Helen, and that process has now been suspended, I think, until August or something like that. So
yeah.
When he does come back, I think he'll make a very important contribution, the same as he has historically.
All right, well, gentlemen, we will have to leave it there. Steve Ciobo and Scott Ludlam, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Helen.